Hello, everybody. Welcome to the curtain raiser for the CII online course on best practices in international business communication. International business communication is a topic that is extremely dear to my heart, both at a personal and professional level. And I hope you enjoy the curtain raiser as well as the course when it does come up. To start with, first of all, let's start with a little question. And what I would like you to do is to answer the question that is on your screen at the moment. I would like you to rate yourself. Rate yourself in your own understanding of doing business with the Americans, Africans, Chinese, Middle Easterners. So I'm taking that the reason you have registered for this course is because you are interested in international communication and at some level or the other are working with colleagues and stakeholders around the world. You must be having some idea of how good or bad you are at communicating with various cultures. So if you could just take a few minutes and help answer this question, the way you could answer it to say, okay, Americans, 6. So that means that on a scale of 1 to 10, you're at 6 when you're dealing with Americans. So if you could please fill up the chat box with these answers so we can get a conversation going. Okay, I'm going to read out some of the answers that are pouring in, literally pouring in. Okay, I like the fact that some of you are absolutely honest and say none of the above. Americans 9, Vinayak says Americans 6, Africans 6, Sunil says 6, Chinese. I want everyone to please take part in this, even if it's a 0, if it's a 9, just take part. At least what you think you are, how good you are or bad you are at communicating with these 4 different cultures, because that is what this course is going to be focusing on making us better communicators with the Americans, the Africans, the Chinese, and the Middle Easterners. So, and if you have no experience with any of them, voila, this is the place to be then. So, I'm getting lots of answers because thank you for saying none of the above. Rajgurtu says Africans 5, Ankit thus says Americans 8, Africans 7, Chinese 5, Middle Eastern 9. So I'm presuming, Ankita, you have a lot of experience working with the Middle Easterners. Shashi Kumar Edji says 1. 1 for what, Shashi? Is it for anyone in particular or just the Americans? Please, I'm just going to give you a couple of more minutes to let the answers roll in. Africa 6. Thank you, Babu. Thank you, Sudhir. Thank you, Ranjit. Thank you, Nagarajan. Thank you, Thangamani. What's coming across is that I think we made the right decision in the cultures that we chose to explore in this course, because either what's coming across is that there is a lot of experience working with them or there is very little experience working with them. But the bottom line is that these 4 cultures do constitute a large part of our business stakeholders at the moment. So I'm going to close this question now and let's start the session officially. And with that, I'm going to close my chat window from which I was reading the answers. And voila, look at this now. Isn't that a wonderful map? The question here is, how prone are we at work to express emotions or to confront each other? How most likely are we to get into an argument or to cry or to get really happy? Now, what you have on your screen at the moment is one of my most favorite infographics on intercultural communication. It has been put together by a lady, she's an author and a professor called Erin Meyer. She's an American based in Paris, and she is most well known for her 2014 book called The Culture Map. And what she did was she did a whole lot of research on various cultures and then mapped them according to these 2 main traits: how emotionally expressive we are or not, and how likely are we to get into an argument, a confrontation or not. And as you can see, it makes for an interesting first glance at how we as global citizens stand. Now, it could be argued that with globalization, these cultural tendencies which we've just talked about, or rather shown, would have been diluted. As it is, as you must be well aware, America is X number of Russians and X number of Chinese and X number of Mexicans and X number of Indians. And according to the New York Journal, there are currently 76,000 Indians in Germany who call themselves Germans. So globalization has made us all merge, cross boundaries, cross borders, adopt other cultures, but the bottom line is that DNA still rules. What we are intrinsically still rules. So therefore, an Indian, whether they are in India or in New York or in South Africa or in Dubai, will intrinsically have more in common with each other than an American or a Japanese. And that's the way it is. So what are we going to be talking about in our upcoming course? It is going to be made up of 9 sessions. And what I would like to share with you is the takeaways of each session, but also share with you 2 tips from each session. So whether you take the course or you don't take the course, you would leave this curtain raiser with 2 valuable learnings from each session, which you could apply straight away. So what are we going to look at the very first session? We're going to talk about email writing, etiquette and best practices. But before I proceed any further, I would like to mention this, that all 9 sessions look at different communication channels, but the context is international communication. So when you are writing emails against a backdrop of international communications, where you're communicating with people across the globe, what are the best practices and etiquette to follow? And so it would be with all the sessions in the series. So in this very first session, what we will be looking at is Indian English versus international English. And yes, we Indians do speak our own version of English, which no one else out there in the world speaks. And we are so used to it, we tend to think that it is the only way to speak English, and it is the correct way to speak English. But what this leads to is that when you're speaking to stakeholders across the borders, they often don't understand what we mean. So we're going to be looking at Indian English and what would be the international English version of those phrases, those words. We're going to talk about writing effective emails so we get the response that we want. There's a certain inverted pyramid format, and we'll see how we can apply it when we are writing emails. And we're going to be ending this session with do's and in email writing. And yes, there are etiquettes or best practices, best behaviors, even within email writing. So let me share a little tip with you. The very first tip of this session. People from different cultures communicate differently, both verbally and non-verbally. At a very, very broad level, cultures can be divided into high context cultures and low context cultures. High context cultures are the Japanese, the Arab, the Chinese. And low context cultures are Germans, Americans, and Scandinavians. What does this mean, this context business? Context means a desire to have a background, a setting, to know people personally. That is not just only work, but that you want to go beyond that. What it translates to is that in low context cultures, they do not want the background. They don't want the fluff. They don't want to know you personally. They want to get to the point quickly. Whereas high context cultures want the fluff. They want the background. They want that extra personal conversation. They want to know you first before doing business with you. And one needs to keep this in mind when communicating with these two broad categories. For if you were to speak to a high context culture person, such as an Arab, keeping in mind a low context culture attitude, they would get offended. You cannot be to the point with an Arab. You need to, how would I say, you need to fluff it, you need to wrap it with polite conversation about their families, about what's happening in their life, about their holidays. All that needs to be involved. It needs to be included in the conversation, and that needs to be kept in mind. It is not something that one just takes lightly. It plays a very important role. Another tip I wanted to share you is just some examples of Indian English and the International English version. Good name. It's a phrase you only hear in India. My good name. What is your good name? What really is the correct way of saying it is, what's your name? Now, another phrase which is very typical in India is myself Rama, I belong to Mumbai. There's nothing called myself Rama. It should be my name is Rama, and we don't belong to a city. We live in a city. So I live in Mumbai. A third example, revert back. Revert actually means to reply to someone. Now, replying is anyway getting back to someone. So in a way, you're repeating yourself here by saying revert back. Just revert is all that needs to be said. The fourth, when you are thanking somebody or somebody thanks you and you respond with mention not, no problem, no worries, no issues, wrong. What it's making it sound like is that it was a problem, it was a worry, and it was an issue, and you're just clarifying that it wasn't. What's more politically correct would be you're welcome, it's my pleasure, that's all right. And one last tip within this category, a phrase we use often, please repeat again. Repeat is anyway saying something again. So just please repeat is all that needs to be said. And these have been taken from a book by Preeti Shirodkar. She's based in Mumbai. If you can get hold of her book, she talks in a lot more detail about Indian English and how to counteract it. So what are we going to look in our second session? Templates. Isn't it lovely if you can have templates which tells you exactly what you have to write when and where? A bit of a copy-paste job. Well, that's what we're going to do in this session, not copy-paste per se, but help you in drafting emails much more quickly by giving you guidelines or scripts for different scenarios and different stakeholders. But first and foremost, we're going to look at when do you use emails? You don't always use emails. There are only certain scenarios, certain situations when you use emails. The rest of the time, it's maybe better to have a face-to-face or a telephonic conversation. So we will look at when should you be using emails. We're then going to look at the email checklist, the 7 C's, which I'm not going to reveal at this point. And then we're going to be looking at template or scripts for emails that you would have to often send whilst you're in office or in a management position, and emails for networking and applying for jobs. Now, I had told you that I would share with you 2 tips for each. So the first tip I would like to share with you from this session is the call to action. Where do you place the call to action? What is your call to action? Your call to action is basically what you want the respondent to do. You're calling them to take a certain action. That's why you are communicating with them in the first place. So where do you put that in an email? You put it in the very first paragraph. That's what you do. In the very first paragraph, if you're writing for the first time, you introduce yourself and then say why you're writing. But if you already know the person, you go straight to the point. Why are you writing? Why do we do that? Because most often, people don't read your entire email. And that's the way it is. Just face it. They would read the first line and the last line. So why not make it easier for your emails to be understood by ensuring that your call to action or the action that you want to have taken is in the very first paragraph. And where else did you put your call to action? In the subject line. Don't have these vague subject lines like hello and thank you. It makes it very difficult to find them when you do a search. Make it specific, related to the content in the email plus the call to action. What exactly are you writing for? Mention it in the subject line. So when the person receives the email, they know exactly what is the email about and what needs to be done. And the length of your subject line, ideally 28 to 39 characters, because when it's longer than that, it gets truncated. So you've got to be really creative when it comes to putting your subject line together. Another tip, when to use emails. There's a whole lot of scenarios when it is appropriate to use emails and when it's not. I'm going to share half of it with you here. So you use emails when you want to convey facts, when the message needs to be part of a permanent file, when there are time constraints. What this means is that you do not need to get a reply immediately. You could get the reply in the afternoon, in the evening. It's not immediate. An email is appropriate then. You do not need immediate feedback. And if the idea is complicated, at times writing it down makes it a lot more easier to communicate it. Saying it is not, one tends to struggle with words then. When you're writing, you can go into a lot more detail. So these are some of the situations in which you would choose to write an email. Cultural frameworks is what we look at in our third session. And here we're going to be talking about 3 cultural frameworks. A lot of research has been done in international communication, lots. We're going to be looking at 3 of these frameworks that have been developed. One is the Lewis model, one is Hofstedes cultural dimensions theory, and the third is Erin Mayer's culture map. We just showed you the map. We're going to be more detailed in deconstructing this particular map. Now, the reason why we are going to be doing this session is one is to appreciate that when you're speaking to people across borders, across nations, it's a risky business. It's much more easier to talk to people in your own country, in your own society. You're all on the same page, or at least you're more on the same page than you are with somebody who works and lives in New York or in Tokyo. So we will understand why it's risky and why, therefore, it is necessary to understand this subject in a bit more detail. And we will look at 3 models that have been developed by 3 different researchers. And you can then pick and choose which you want to use as a guide in the future, or you could use all 3, but at least you would understand how each framework works as a guide for you to fall back on. Sharing a tip, I'm going to share one of the frameworks with you here, and this is the Lewis model. It has been developed by a British communication consultant. His name is Richard Lewis, and he developed this wonderful, bright, colorful triangle, and he has mapped societies or cultures on it with 3 main corner points: multi-active, linear active, and reactive. And which are those that are absolutely in the extremes and where some of them fall in between. So what exactly is linear active? The main traits that define a linear active culture, according to Lewis, is they're very cool, they're factual, and they're decisive, plus they're planners. They love to plan. They do one thing at a time. They're very level-headed. They like facts. The multi-active, on the other hand, are very warm people. They're extremely emotional. They love to talk, and they just do things on the spur of the moment. The Brazilians and the Chileans are the epitome of this kind of cultural dimension. And then we have the reactive people, where at the extreme end you have the Vietnamese. They are courteous, amiable, they accommodate, they're always understanding, they're compromising, they're good listeners. And somewhere in between, the rest of us all fall. Now, deconstructing it a little bit in this particular session, in this tip, I would like to now share with you, what does it mean in practice? So when you talk about the Lewis model and you want to understand it in practice, what does it mean? When you're talking about talking, a person who is linear active will talk half the time. A person who is multi-active will talk most of the time. And a person who is reactive will listen most of the time. So going back, this will then make you understand that if you're speaking to a German or Swiss, they're going to talk very little. A Brazilian or a Chilean will be talking a lot more. And a Vietnamese, a Chinese, a Japanese will be listening more. Another small illustration of how it maps out in practice, a linear active person is results oriented. They want to see results. Whereas a multi-active person is relationship oriented. It's wrong to say multi-active person. I would rather say a multi-active culture is relationship oriented. Relationships of utmost importance to them. Work is secondary, results are secondary. And a reactive is neither relationship nor results. The priority for them is harmony. That is the defining principle or defining goal for them. So that looks at the third session. In the fourth session, we're going to now go a little more deeper into international communication. And we're going to be looking at communicating with America and Africa. So we will understand the cultural dimensions of Americans and Africans. Remember, we in the last session would have discussed cultural frameworks. We would then deconstruct those frameworks and see how does that help us to understand Americans and Africans, to understand what exactly do they stand for culturally. And keeping that understanding in mind, we will look at when you are then writing to them, how should you write to them? And when you're speaking to them, how should you speak to them? And your body language. Your body language is as communicative as the words you say. So what body language should one use when one is speaking with the Americans and Africans, and what gestures to use or not use, so you don't offend anybody and you are in their good books and you're understood by them. A tip. I had mentioned to you earlier about one of the frameworks that would be studying would be Hofstede's cultural dimensions. Now, Hofstede was a Dutch social psychologist, and he studied 76 countries. And he used 6 cultural dimensions or 6 cultural variables to distinguish between cultures and understand them better. And for each dimension, it was a scaling of from 0 to 100. Now, if you go into his website, which is on the screen, there's a fantastic feature which enables you to enter 2, 1, 2 or more countries and see where they stand next to each other in terms of these cultural dimensions. But right now on the screen, let me just explain a few things about the Indian American context in a little more detail. So when you put the Indians against the Americans in comparison, India in comparison with United States, there are 6 main cultural dimensions according to Hofstede, which define what we are as people. But what is of particular interest is the masculinity part. What is the masculinity cultural dimension? It states how masculine or feminine we are as societies. What this again further means is that as a society, how patriarchal, or where men are men, they can get away with things, men don't cry, power is all important. These particularly masculine beliefs are ingrained into a society. And then on the other extreme end, you have the feminine societies where both men and women are treated as equals. So when I'm saying femininity, I'm not saying that the woman becomes more important, but in a feminist society, they are both treated as equals. Both men and women are allowed to cry. Both men and women are allowed to run after their life goals and become something. They're both allowed to dream. So those are the two extremes. And very interestingly, India and the US are in fact very similar in terms of this particular cultural dimension. So when it comes to how patriarchal we are as societies, how masculine or feminine we are as societies, America and India are much closer to each other than you would think. However, on the other hand, if you look at indulgence, which is another cultural dimension of how prone to indulging ourselves are we, spoiling ourselves, catering to our sensual desires, America is at 68, whereas the Indians are far more reserved at 26. Now let's look at this. Africans. I lived in Africa for a very long time. I worked there as well. And what I would like to share with you is something firsthand from my own personal experience, that when you're in Africa, and Africa is a continent, mind you, not a country, but there are some rules that are the same no matter where you are on the continent, and that is the left hand. You do not use the left hand. It is considered impolite. It is considered dirty. You do not use it. So you never give with your left hand. You never salute with your left hand. And if you're writing somebody's name, even if you're left-handed, you don't write their name with your left hand. Sounds a little extreme, but that's the way it is. The left hand and its use is interpreted as being impolite and being disrespectful. And that is the quickest and the easiest way that if you did not know, you could perhaps end up offending somebody you're working with in Africa. 5. So we talked about communicating with America and communicating with Africa. Now let's look at China and the Middle East, the two other stakeholder nations that we had selected for this course. And we're going to the same. We'll look at the cultural dimensions of China and the Middle East, deconstruct the theories we've studied in our third session, understand them better as cultures, and then see how do we communicate with them verbally, in writing, what body language to use, and again, what gestures to use and not use. Tip time. Again, remember I told you that in Hofstedes' website, you can enter different countries and see where they stand next to each other. So then this is India in comparison with China. And as you can see, when it comes to indulgence, whilst we were so different from the Americans, we are much more familiar with the Chinese. However, look at the long-term orientation. Long-term orientation means looking in the future, planning for the future. Everything is long-term. When you have a short-term orientation, you're more inclined to live for today. Today is all that matters. Kal kisne dekha? And if you look at this particular cultural variable, the Chinese are at 87. So for them, tomorrow is important, very important. Whereas for the Indians, we stand at 51. We are somewhere in between. We are also extremely dynamic, evolving society. So maybe that is why right now we're somewhere in between. Middle East. For those of you who are working with people in the Middle East, it helps to know that in the Middle East, they're extremely status conscious. Status is very important for them. And it's very important that you address people by their correct titles, especially if they are superior to you by post or by rank, as well as if you have any Arab colleagues. So some common titles that are used in the Middle East, and which, if you used, would definitely put you in the good books with them, is Sheikh, which means a wise man or scholar. Sayyid is a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad, and Haji is a man who has made the pilgrimage to Mecca. So if you know somebody has made the pilgrimage, address them with Haji. It will be received extremely warmly. Listening and questioning is what goes into our 6th session. And what we're going to be looking here is what is mindful listening. Mindful listening is different from active listening. So remember, there are different stages of listening. One is where you don't listen at all. The other is where you pretend to listen. Then the third is active listening. And the fourth is mindful listening. We're going to be looking at the first 3 briefly, but pondering more in detail into mindful listening. What does it mean and how does one listen mindfully? And then we're going to be looking at questions. There are different types of questions. How do you ask different types of questions, and how do you respond to different types of questions? And what kind of answer is each question looking for? So you know what to answer and when to ask which question. Now let me share some interesting facts about listening. According to research, when we're listening, we in fact only listen to 25 to 50% of what is being said to us, and vice versa, which means that when you're talking, the other person is only listening to 25 to 50% of what you're saying. And this is happening when you're actively listening. When you're pretending to listen, the figure is even lower than 25. So why do we listen mindfully? So we can rise above the 50%, because mindful listening allows you to go from 50 to 100%. Mindful listening. I said that it is one level above active listening. The of mindful listening is that it monitors, the key word is monitors. It monitors our thoughts, our feelings or our emotions, as well as our reactions whilst we are listening. So whilst we're listening, we are aware of our thoughts, we are aware of our emotions, our feelings, and aware of our reactions. And we monitor it, which means that we are able to control it. We are aware of it and we are able to control it. To break it down into a little more detail, what this translates to in practice is that when you're listening, you listen without distractions. And distractions are not just external noises, they're also internal noises. In fact, the internal noises are louder, way louder than the external ones. Another key part of mindful listening is to listen without judgment. And how do you know when you're judging somebody? We have physical and emotional reactions when we are judging somebody. And what we'll be looking at in this session is how do we become aware of these reactions? So then we can be able to manage them. But why do we listen mindfully? So that when we're listening, we rise above the 25 to 50%, which I talked to you about just now, and we can absorb what is being said. And also the other person can always make out when they're being listened to or not. And when you listen mindfully, they will notice that they are being listened to mindfully and that they are being understood. And the most wonderful byproduct of mindful listening is better relationships, both at the workplace as well as in your personal spaces. The 7th session looks at body language best practices. This is a fun topic. We're going to be talking about how do you mirror people and why should you mirror people? Mirroring establishes rapport. We're then going to talk about body language at work for her, that's the woman, and body language at work for him, the man. And they're not the same at all. And we shouldn't even try to make it the same. So we'll see how, for a man, what is the best way to sit, to talk, and for eye contact. We'll go into all those details. And finally, we're going to be introducing NLP, neuro-linguistic programming. It'll be a brief introduction to NLP. So if you enjoy the subject, you can go into it in a lot more detail. Tips time. Mastering meetings. We all attend meetings. Now, wouldn't we like to come across wonderfully intelligent and savvy in these meetings and be a pro at them? Just a small body language tip here, that when you're in a meeting, when you're pointing at people, keep your hands closed, which means that your fingers are together. You don't point at anybody with your fingers, but you keep your fingers together. And also, when you move your hands around, try and minimize the movements and never let them rise above chin level. If you do these little constraints in your hand movement, if you are able to manage these, you will come across as a lot more powerful. And people who do these small little things command the most respect. And this is again taken from research done. And if you'd like to read more about body language, do check the book Body Language in the Workplace by Ellen and Barbara Pease. And from this same book, I want to share another little tip with you. Eye contact. To build a good rapport with another person, we all know you have to maintain eye contact. But a question that I'm often asked is, how much eye contact? If you stare, you're rude. If you don't look, you're considered to be shy and insecure. So how much eye contact is healthy, is normal? It's 60 to 70% of the time that you're having a conversation with them. 8. The 8th session is on networking, and we're going to be talking about the elevator pitch as well as small talk. We'll look into what is business and dining etiquette, the art of small talk, being able to talk to an absolute stranger, no matter where, and having a wonderful conversation with them. How do you do that? How do you network before, during, and post an event so that it's productive? And we're going to be looking at the effective elevator pitch. And here, I would like to invite all of you to do this little exercise in this session, and that is crafting an elevator pitch for yourselves. Now, Bernard Marr, he's an author, he's also a keynote speaker and a business and data expert. He says that when you are crafting or giving an elevator pitch, instead of talking about what you do, talk about who do you help. That's what people love to hear. That's what people want to hear. It's far more remembered when that's the way you introduce yourselves. So at this point, I would invite you to, in the chat window, type in this line. Hi, my name is, and I help companies. And that is your introduction. So let me get to know you all a little better here. And I'm going to give you around 5 minutes for this little exercise. Give it some thought and key in the words. I'm going to read out some of the answers that come in because they're interesting, to say the least. Vinay says, hi, my name is Vinay Mehta, and I help companies innovate their processes and products for better customers. Interesting. Sangeet says, hi, my name is Sangeet Grover, and I help companies help others grow. Ranjit says, hi, my name is Ranjit Lenka. Hello, Ranjit. Maybe you could go into a little more detail about how you are helping other people. Naveen says, hi, my name is Naveen. I help companies to minimize their energy costs. Now, wonderful. It's so, well, how should I say it? It gives a far more clearer picture of what value you could add to the other person's life when that is the way you introduce yourself, instead of introducing yourself with titles and where you work. So Alex says, hi, my name is Alex, and I help companies help improve day-to-day business. And Bhumika says, my name is Bhumika. I help companies understand their way forward in HR. Priya says, oh God, they're running in now. Okay. Ketan says, I help companies in managing materials. Now, Ketan, maybe you can go into a little more detail here and say, what do you mean by materials? Materials is a rather generic word. Go into a little broader. It's rather broad. So maybe be a bit more specific. Neeraj says, oops, sorry. Again, Lawrence says, hello, my name is Divya and I help companies with innovative ideas. Now, I would just like to mention here that maybe you would like to go into a little more detail about what value are you adding. Just a little more detail. So I like this. Amit says, my name is Amit and I help my colleagues to release their stress by making fun at work. Wonderful. To go back, Neeraj says, my name is Neeraj and I help my company by providing innovative, cost-effective, qualitative and timely products for the customers. Vishal says, my name is Vishal and I help companies who are into infrastructure with our innovative design software. Now, wonderful. Thank you for all these answers that have come in. And I want to ask you a little question here. And I want you to be dead honest. When you introduce yourselves, have you been introducing yourselves the way you have just now? And just give me a yes or a no. Have you, when somebody says, so nice to know you, do you tell them? Thank you for the answer. So a lot of no's, a couple of yeses. But have you noticed while doing this that it makes it a lot more fun to introduce yourself? And it also, from the very outset, establishes how you are adding value to the other person's life, or how you can add value to the other person's life. Because at the end of the day, the bottom line is, what's in it for me? And the other person needs to feel it, to understand it, and to accept it and appreciate it. And that'll only happen if you articulate it. So I'm going to close this little exercise here, and we're going to move on. Small talk. One more tip. Remember, I told you there would be 2 tips per session. And the tip that I would like to share here is, in small talk, don't talk about religion. Don't talk about politics. It's dangerous. It is absolutely dangerous, and it can go all over the place. So in fact, you should stick to religion and politics only if you know a person extremely well. But for first conversations, these are taboo topics, literally. Never gossip. But here I would like to bring your attention to the 4th point. Never speak to just one person in a group. So you're having small talk, you're networking, there's a group of people. We have a tendency to connect with one person. And we'll get into a conversation with just one person. And the others tend to then feel left out. Those kind of conversations one-on-one are not part of small talk, unless it is just 2 people that are in that conversation to start with. But if you are networking at an event and there's groups of people and you're joining groups to have small talk, or it's a public place and there are groups of people, try and talk to everybody in that group and not just to one person. And I hope you'll keep that little point in mind. And with this, then we come to our 9th session, which is going to be our last session. And here we're going to be talking about communicating with social media do's and don'ts. I think it's very important, this whole topic, and that is why I have added it to the course. With globalization, with talking to people across the borders, we're one big global village at the moment. And social media has made the word even smaller. But making it smaller, it's also very easy to goof up in this platform, in these channels. Very easy to goof up. So one needs to know what one should and shouldn't do when there's so much freedom to communicate available. So what we're going to be talking about in this session is LinkedIn definitions and etiquette. The ideal length of everything online. Yes, there is an ideal length for everything online, including your subject line, including a slide share, including a YouTube video, including a talk. There is an ideal length for everything online as per research, so that you know that if you work within that little frame, you maximize your chances of being heard, being responded to, of getting the attention you want. And when is the best time and day to post? Yes, whether it's Facebook, Twitter, or LinkedIn, you don't just post anything, anytime. There are specific days and times when you would get a better response, better chances of being retweeted, clicked on, being liked, being responded to. So we're going to be looking at what are those best times and days to post, and some serious rules of do's and don'ts on social media so that you can use them in a far more mature way. Tip number 1, private messages. Did you know that in the UK, 20% of divorce filings include the word Facebook? Yep. Facebook has its good points and its bad points, and it's very easy to waver when you're on Facebook. Facebook builds relationships, but Facebook also is notorious for having destroyed many relationships. And I want you to just keep in mind, now if the second point, everything that you put on Facebook, whether it's private or public, can be viewed. Anybody who has access to your login information can get into your Facebook account and read everything that you have written, posted, either as private messages or public. And unless you delete a private message completely, all it happens is it goes as an archived message. So it hasn't been deleted, it has been archived. So it won't show up, but it's lying there if somebody was to dig into your message piles. One needs to therefore use all social media with a certain level of maturity about what you're going to be communicating or putting across this platform. And remember that even private messages, you're deleting a message doesn't erase it. The other person also needs to delete it. So therefore, just be a little more careful about what you post. If you want the whole world to see it, if you want your boss to see it, if you want your wife or your husband to see it, then it's safe. If any of it is no, then avoid putting it up. And the last tip I would like to share with you today is the 18 minutes. According to research, after 20 minutes, people stop paying attention, people stop remembering what you're saying. Now, this session has gone on for an hour, so I don't know how many of you have lost after 20 minutes. I hope I've been able to keep you at least logged on to some extent or another and kept being able to capture your attention to some extent or the other. But when you're doing a talk, 20 minutes is generally the cutoff time. And therefore, all TEDx talks are just 18 minutes or under, so that they can retain their audience's attention till the very end. And with this, dear all, I come to the end of this curtain raiser for CII's online course on best practices in international business communication. And from here on, I would be more than happy to take your questions regarding this course. I hope you enjoyed this curtain raiser. I hope whatever tips I've been able to share have been of some value to you, and that you've enjoyed what we have talked about in this last 1 hour. So any questions, please feel free to ask.